Good morning, everybody. After World War I, the German army was limited as part of the stipulations of the Versailles Peace Treaty. And one of the reasons the Nazis were influential is they promised to rip up the Versailles Treaty, basically. And it was on this date in 1935, March 16, that the Nazis issued an edict rebuilding the German army. This photograph of dead German soldiers during World War I reminds us of the terrible military cost of World War I. Germany, for instance, lost almost 2 million soldiers in World War I. When the Versailles Conference gathered outside of Paris after the war, Woodrow Wilson on the right, the Germans were not invited. So they had to wait on the sidelines, so to speak, to see what the Allies would do. And many people focus on the reparations that Germany had to pay for war damages. But in addition to this, the Allies put big limits on the German military. They were really nervous about Germany becoming a military power again. Now, these soldiers are from the interwar period. They're known as the Reichswehr. And this German army was limited. Here's a picture of the German Air Force from World War I. That was actually banned. So again, another way that the Allies were going to try to limit the military growth of Germany. So things changed in 1920. The Treaty of Rapallo was a treaty between the Russians and the Germans in which Russia allowed Germany to use part of the Russian landmass to actually build up their military. And the key player here was Werner von Blomberg. He was a World War I vet, and he was really instrumental in this end run around the Treaty of Versailles trying to rebuild the German army. Well, in the early 1930s, Hitler became chancellor, and here he is shaking hands with Paul von Hindenburg, who was an icon of the old Germany. You notice he's got that Prussian helmet on. But when Hindenburg died in 1934, this was one of the last limits on Hitler doing what he wanted to do. So he really went both barrels getting the army rebuilt. And here's a picture of the German army, now called the Wehrmacht, which is our event for today. And you'll notice the soldiers are pledging a personal oath to Hitler. That was not Hitler's idea. That was Blomberg's idea, but Hitler went along with it. So these are the images of the Wehrmacht that we know from the newsreels of the 1930s. Really disciplined, really big, much bigger than Versailles allowed. And the first test of the army came in 1936 when Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland. This was an area of Germany that had been occupied by the French after World War I. And even though the French army was a lot bigger than the German army, the French did nothing. So when the German army came into the Rhineland, pictured here, they were met with huge cheers and enthusiastic crowds, even though the generals were nervous about this. And then in 1938, when Germany absorbed Austria, the army again didn't feel they were ready for war, but the Allies caved. They didn't do a thing about it. And here's a picture of the Germans coming into Vienna with big cheers. So far the army is doing okay. They're used as sort of a pawn in this big chess game. And then in 1938, when Hitler decided he wanted to absorb the Sudetenland, which was a part of Western Czechoslovakia where there were some ethnic Germans, the threat of war again came in Europe, and the Allies did not want war. Hitler realized that. This using the army as a threat was part of his strategy, and it worked. And here he is signing the Munich Pact, in which the Allies sort of caved in, and the Czechs were eventually taken over by the Germans. And after the Munich Pact, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, came home and said, "We now have peace in our time." Here he is waving the paper, but this becomes an image of futility. So here we are, Blitzkrieg, September 1, 1939. This is going to be the first real test of the Wehrmacht. When World War II begins, and eventually Germany will be facing a two-front war which will lead to its defeat.